All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out to Arkham Nights 2016. I'm Nate French, and I'm here with Matt Newman. We were the co-designers on the new Arkham horror card game, the LCG, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the considerations and things that we encountered as we were developing the game. We started with this. This was kind of the kernel of the idea, was a game that plays like an LCG, but as you're playing it, it feels like an RPG. And this was kind of the initial pitch behind the vision, and everything else developed around this idea. All right, so a quick overview of what we're going to be doing in this presentation, just to give everybody a sense of where we're at as we go through it. First, we're going to talk about this vision that I mentioned on the previous page. Then we're going to talk about this concept of storytelling within the Arkham LCG, kind of some of the challenges and opportunities that we discovered as we were developing the game as it relates to the art of storytelling. And then finally, at the end, we're going to take some questions from the audience. But first, just a little history on who we are. I already introduced our names. I'm Nate French. This is Matt Newman. And we both work in the LCG department at Fantasy Flight Games. I've been here since 2006, and Matt came in 2012. One thing about the LCG department, we work very much as a team, so there's a bunch of different games up on the screen, and over the years, there's a good chance that at least one of us has worked in some capacity on one of those games, on each of those games. You'll also notice up there that Lord of the Rings is kind of a little more prominent than all the others. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, it's the game that Matt and I have the most shared experience on. I was involved in the core design of that game, and then around 2012, when we brought Matt in, he came in to help design scenarios and new player cards for the game. Interesting story about that. When the game first came out, there were a bunch of people doing fan-made content on Board Game Geek, and some of it was really cool, and we noticed it around the office. And then during the job search, as we were going through the interview process, we made a connection that Matt was one of the people who did some of the scenarios that we found really exciting. So he came around, and something that he was doing for fun, he ended up doing professionally. So I think that was just a cool story about that I wanted to share. The other reason why Lord of the Rings is featured on this slide is because it is the only other LCG we have that is cooperative, like Arkham Horror. So in a lot of ways, it is a precursor game to Arkham. Arkham's an evolution of some of the concepts there, and we'll be referring back to that game throughout the presentation for those reasons, and kind of making some comparisons and showing some of the evolutions. Okay, so this vision of an LCG meets an RPG. For anyone who's not familiar, LCG stands for Living Card Game, RPG stands for Role-Playing Game. Just really quick to get a sense of what we're dealing with here. How many of you have played one of our LCGs before? Okay, good number. And how many have played an RPG before? Another good number. Okay, so I can go through this pretty quick. I'm just going to go through some of the core elements of kind of what we were focusing on when we were trying to meet this vision of merging these two games together. These were the concepts that were kind of central to our vision. So Living Card Game is card-driven. This is pretty obvious. The cards do the heavy lifting in providing the experience. We don't have miniatures to work with. We don't have a board. The cards have to do all the work. Tactical and strategic challenges, we wanted to hit both of those buttons that are very important to LCG players. Custom deck building, this is basically the idea that you have a large pool of cards to start with, and you kind of refine a deck and select the cards from the pool that kind of express something you want to do in the game, and your deck almost becomes your own creation, and you start to identify with it. We want that experience to be a part of this game. Synergy and card combos, trying to find the most efficient use of the card slots in your deck was an important concept to hit on. And then finally, an ever-growing card pool. This is common to all of our LCGs, that it starts with a core set of cards, and over time, new cards are released, and players collect these cards. The main difference between this and a CCG is that in a living card game, all the cards that you acquire are fixed, and you know exactly what you're buying. There's no random purchases involved. So then a role-playing game. The most important consideration here is that the game is character-based. In some of our games, you're not the character, but in a role-playing game, you take on the role of a character and act out the behavior of that character through the experience. The sense that it's cooperative, players are working together against a game run scenario is kind of the core experience of this game. The idea of skill checks. So in RPGs, one thing that when your character wants to do something, it's not always 100% obvious that you can or can't do that. So the skill checks are kind of the way that you determine if your character is able to do what you want that character to do. The idea of scenario-driven campaigns. This is just that any single game is not necessarily a standalone experience. The idea that one game leads to the next and leads to the next, and that over time this broader narrative emerges and kind of a campaign story takes place. That was something that we were going for right from the start. And then finally, the game provides a narrative experience. We don't want a game to just be trying to get the most points, trying to collect the most money, trying to kill the most monsters. We want a story to emerge as part of the experience of the game. And this is kind of, this idea here is going to be central to much of the rest of the presentation, because I think this is one of the biggest challenges, telling a story working just with the medium of cards. Like we don't have novels or TV screens or anything else. We just have to use the cards to tell the story. So we're going to talk about kind of some of the challenges and opportunities that we discovered as we were developing the game to make this happen. So narrative in the Arkham LCG. How are we going to tell these stories through the card game? We're going to look at this question in a variety of different ways tonight, using the elements of fiction to kind of structure our approach. So the elements of fiction, I do have a little bit of a background with writing, so these are kind of the basic building blocks that go into any story. The first one is character, who the story is about. Point of view, this is kind of the perspective from which the story is being told, where the audience is at as they see the story. Plot is what happens in the story and the order in which it happens. Setting is where the story happens. Conflict is kind of what's at stake, the two sides that are butting heads in the story. Theme is what's the story about, what's the meaning of it. And then finally, style and tone. This is how the story is being told, what kind of aesthetic decisions you're making as you tell the story. So we're going to take a look at each of these. And we're going to start with character, and Matt's going to come in and talk about that.
Hello everyone, I'm Matt. Can you guys all hear me? Very concerned about the mic. All right, so let's talk about character for a bit. As Nate said, in most games, and indeed in all of our other LCGs, you as a player, you don't exist as a character within the story. You're usually a disembodied being kind of floating above the action, manipulating things, moving cards around, and as an LCG, your deck is usually an assortment of different characters, usually composed of the same faction, be it House Lannister or Space Marines, that kind of thing. But in a role-playing game, it's character-based. You, as a player, you take on the active role of a major character within the story. So we wanted to express that in a living card game format. So we thought the best way to do that is through the deck, through your Investigator deck. So you are an investigator in Arkham, and your deck is an expression or a representation of your investigator. Your deck is filled with all of your investigator's abilities, their contacts, their allies, their spells, and their knowledge. And just like in a role-playing game where at the beginning of a campaign, you're going to create your character, and you're going to have a character sheet, and you're going to allocate points to different stats and purchase abilities, in an LCG, in Arkham Horror, you're going to build your deck. So at the start of a campaign, you build your deck and you choose what cards you want to put in your deck, representing all kinds of different things that your investigator has access to at that moment in time. So another thing that we wanted to do with this game was we have this list of investigators from our Arkham Files games, and you've probably seen them in all these other Arkham Files games, Arkham Horror, Eldritch Horror, Elder Sign. They're recurring characters, and they all have their own stories, their own backstory elements, their personality flaws, their strengths. So we wanted to represent that in the game in a really tangible way. And that's where we came up with the idea of signature cards. The idea that each investigator comes with a couple investigator-specific cards. Some of them are helpful, some of them are harmful, and you're forced to put them into your deck. And in that way, we capture really the essence of who each investigator is. Another thing that we did differently in this game is with deck building rules and deck building restrictions. In most of our LCGs, if you've played any of our other LCGs before, you'll know that they have some kind of universal mechanic that ties together all of the deck building rules. For example, in Netrunner, you have Influence that allows you to purchase cards from other factions. In Conquest, we have the alignment wheel that says which factions can ally with other factions, and that changes the way that you build your deck. But we wanted to approach that in a different way with Arkham, and we wanted to put the character in the limelight. So the way that we did that is each investigator has their own rules for how to build their deck. So you probably noticed by now, all of the investigators in the core set have a primary class and a secondary class, but that's not the way it's always going to work out. And this allows us the flexibility to do really whatever we want with each and every investigator in the game. Another way that we express characters through weaknesses. So just like any good character in any good story, all characters have flaws as well as strengths. And we wanted to reflect that in our game as well. But how are we going to do that when I'm building my deck and my deck is filled with only the stuff I want to put in it, right? So it's filled with only good things. So naturally, we put some bad things in your deck. Sorry about that. So these weakness cards represent personality flaws, madnesses, injuries, different elements of your backstory, sometimes even monsters that are hunting you down from scenario to scenario. And what's really great, some of these are investigator specific and are tied to your investigator's backstory. And other ones are randomly dealt to you at the beginning of a campaign. So that way, every time you play, you're going to get a slightly different experience based on what weakness you have. And what we found really interesting and really great about this weakness system is, unlike in Lord of the Rings, where your choice of deck changes the way that you tackle the problems and challenges before you, in Arkham, your choice of deck sometimes affects the problems and challenges before you. So for example, in one campaign, you might be running through the woods, running away from a ghoul, and then, oh no, your war injury from your leg pops up, and you trip and fall, and the ghouls eat you. That's one possible story based on a weakness, but another time you play, maybe you're not running from ghouls, you're running away from the mob because you owe them money, and it's kind of a bad idea. So we thought that was really interesting how that changes every campaign. You never really do forget the first time that a stubborn detective pops out of a closet in your study and you're trying to leave. And this makes all the characters feel more human too, because if we were trapped in this kind of situation, we'd have our own flaws that pop up from time to time as well. So next I'm going to talk about point of view. As Nate said earlier, point of view is sort of the lens or perspective through which you view the story. So in this game, obviously the point of view is going to be second person. Everything's kind of about you. You, as your investigator, you are the protagonist of this story, and we wanted to really push that theme. So we did that in a number of ways. Firstly, with the language and the templating of the game, we kind of had this in mind all throughout the development of the game. One example, we use the word player and investigator pretty much interchangeably, so as to put you into the shoes of the character that you're controlling. We also wouldn't say something like the player who controls the investigator with the highest intellect. We would instead just say the investigator with the highest intellect. So that's one way that we express that. Another way that we did that is with slots. So if your deck represents all of the things your character has access to, then the cards in front of you represent all the things that you have right now at that moment in time, right? So we wanted to limit the amount of things that you could have in front of you so as to represent the limitations of a single character. So for example, you only have 2 hands, you only have 1 body, 1 accessory, and so on. So if you're holding a shotgun, you can't also be holding a magnifying glass and a flashlight and a .48 automatic and 3 more shotguns. So finally, the last way that we express point of view in here is with the campaign in the core set. We wanted to really start the game off with an intimate and personal story and set it in a place that's familiar to everyone. So what's more familiar than your own house? So that's why we decided to have the story start the way it does. It really puts you right in the center, in a center role of the story. And what's interesting is it makes players think about what would they do if this happened to them, and it kind of makes them picture their own house while they're going through, which we really liked. So now Nate's going to talk about plot.
All right, I'm back. Plot. Plot is what happens in the story and the order in which it happens. Okay, so the primary mechanic in Arkham Horror to kind of structure the plot around are the two decks, the Act deck and the Agenda deck. And for those who are familiar with the Lord of the Rings game, which we mentioned earlier, this is a pretty obvious point where it's an evolution from one game to the next. So the way that would be the quest deck in Lord of the Rings. So the way the quest deck worked, it's basically a stacked deck that gets set up in a sequential order at the beginning of the game, and as the players play the game, they're trying to place progress on this deck, and when a certain number of progress is reached, they advance to the next stage, read the next stage of the quest, and it tells them what happens next in the story. There's one deck in Lord of the Rings, and now it's two decks in Arkham Horror. So how do these two decks work? Well, we have the Act deck, which works very similarly in that it tracks the player progress. You're trying to collect clues. When you have enough clues to advance, you spend them to advance the Act deck and move on to the next stage of the story. At the same time that this is going on, then the Agenda deck is tracking the progress made by the bad guys, the forces of the mythos or the villains that you're up against in the scenario. They're trying to acquire Doom, and you as the players don't want them to acquire Doom, but if they reach certain thresholds, then the Agenda deck will advance, and generally this means that something terrible is about to happen. The interesting thing about these two decks is that each will advance at its own pace, so you're going to get the opportunity for a lot of different plots to emerge, even from a single scenario. You might have one where the players do really well, they speed through the Act deck, and the Agenda deck is lagging behind, and that will be one possible plot. You could also at the same time have one where basically the exact opposite happens, and the Agenda deck advances, the players are struggling, don't make a lot of progress, and you get a completely different plot from the same scenario. And then you have kind of the whole range in between, where one starts off well, then the other one comes back a little, and there's more of a back and forth race. So the interplay between these two decks provides a lot of flexibility in the different stories that can be told plot-wise. Okay, moving on. The next element to talk about is setting, and we use location cards to establish a sense of setting, which kind of accomplishes two things, both establishing both place and the ability to move from place to place. These location cards provide both of those. So basically at the beginning of the game, a bunch of location cards will be set up on the table, and this creates a map that needs to be explored, and that kind of creates a sense of the players. You have this mystery to solve, and it shows you the area in which you'll be solving it right up front, and then there's mechanisms for moving from one location to another. Another thing these locations do is they can provide a sense of mystery, in that many of them, when they're first set up, are set up with kind of with a mystery side face up, where you don't really know what's in there. You only know, like, oh, we could go down to the cellar, but you don't know what is in the cellar until you move into it. Then the card flips over, and whatever's going to happen down there is revealed to you. There's one question that these cards pose to players, especially if you're playing in a group, and this is kind of a classic question among the horror genre of, should we stay together or should we split up? And there'll be different times in the game where the answer to this question differs. If Matt and I are playing, it's naturally we're probably going to want to stick together because we can protect one another, we can help each other. If an enemy pops up, we can work together to defeat it. But there'll be times in a scenario where the pressures of what we're trying to accomplish make it seem better for us to split up, and kind of moving back and forth between these two states can kind of add to that horror experience. One other thing we like about the locations, kind of as designers, is that location cards can define pretty much any type of environment we want to, and we're not limited by any type of size or scale requirements the way we might be with a board. So it's a really flexible system that it should allow us to do a lot of different things with the game moving forward. Okay, moving on to the next element. Matt's going to come back and talk about conflict.
Hello again. It's been so long. All right, let's talk about conflict for a bit. So you can't have a good story without conflict. That would be a boring story, probably. So let's talk about conflict. How are we going to show conflict in this game? Well, if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings and you've seen this game before, you pretty much know the answer to that is the encounter deck. So in every scenario that you play in Arkham Horror, the card game, there's going to be an encounter deck. And this encounter deck is made up of all kinds of different horrible cards: obstacles, enemies, mobsters, curses, madnesses, injuries, etc. And each scenario has its own encounter deck, and sometimes it's filled with cards from encounter sets that you've already seen, but a lot of times it's filled with unique cards that are specific to that encounter as well. So every scenario feels different in that way. What's different between this and Lord of the Rings is, like I was saying before, we really wanted to stress the point of view and the idea of you as one character being the focal point for the entire adventure. So the main way we did that is, in this game, you're going to each draw your own encounter card, and typically, sometimes it'll affect the group, but typically it affects only you. And this is very different from the way we did it in Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a story about a group of people all, coming together to face some ultimate evil. So in this game, it's different. Another way that we accomplished this is with the threat area, also known during development as the danger zone, also known as your own personal hell. The threat area is where all things currently afflicting you, your character, go. So enemies engaged with you, curses, injuries, afflictions, that sort of thing. And what's really great about the threat area is it flexes that stay or split up system that Nate was talking about earlier, and it really helps you feel that sense of identity, that this is my character, and these are the things happening to my character. For example, if me and Nate are in a room and there's a ghoul engaged with me, or a ghoul priest, why not? The ghoul priest is engaged with me. Nate can help me out, or he could just get up and leave. No, not right now. Come back. And the system really does that really easily. He's not, okay. So another way that we represented conflict in the game is through skill tests. Like Nate was saying before, skill checks are an important facet of a lot of role-playing games. They add a layer of tension and uncertainty that's really important for gaming. In most of our LCGs, this is accomplished through my opponent. Whatever cards he has in his hand, those are cards that I don't know about, and that's the way that I don't know what is going to happen when I do something. But in a cooperative game, it's really important to have that sense of uncertainty. So skill tests are this game's primary means of conflict resolution. Whenever you want to try to do something, you're typically going to have to make a skill test in order to see if you succeed or fail. And the way that we do that in this game is with the chaos bag. Yay! So the chaos bag, I was going to pull a token out of here, but I'm holding a microphone, so I didn't realize how tough that would be. So every time you want to do a skill test in this game, you're going to reach into this chaos bag, and you're going to pull out a token, and that's going to modify your chances of success or failure. And like I said before, this adds tension and uncertainty. So why tokens? Why are we doing a chaos bag? We actually explored a lot of different options before we landed on the chaos tokens, but they were far and above the best option for a lot of different reasons. I'm going to put this away now. First of all, it's a visceral and physical experience. We really liked the idea that you are reaching into this bag of the unknown and pulling out something probably awful for you, and probably awful for everyone else too. And you're the one kind of with your hand in there reaching for a token, so if you pull out the wrong token, that's a little bit, that's on you. So we really like that, and we thought that was really cool. Another reason why we like it is because it has like endless scaling and customization options. So every campaign that you play is going to start off with a slightly different chaos bag, and that adjusts the experience. Every difficulty mode has different tokens in the chaos bag. And then of course we can have card effects and campaign effects that adjust the bag from scenario to scenario, or even within a certain game. And that's really easy to do and really fluid with the chaos tokens. And then finally, if you've played any of our other Arkham Files games, Arkham Horror, Eldritch Horror, Elder Sign, you are no stranger to pulling tokens out of a bag. So we really liked that this was a throwback to our other Arkham Files games. It kind of becomes a hallmark of the entire IP. So next, let's talk about theme. A lot of good stories have a common theme that ties everything together and sort of mirrors the action that's happening. And a common theme in our Arkham IP and also in the Lovecraft mythos is consequence. So consequence in this case is the idea that my actions have consequences for everyone around me and for the rest of the world. And also the forces of the mythos, what they're doing, that's going to have consequences for me as a character. I'm going to go insane and I'm going to have bad things happen to me. So we wanted to do that with campaign play. So campaign play means that every scenario you play is going to link together into a broader campaign, and it's going to tell a longer story than one scenario would. This is very similar to the way that RPGs work, where every time you play, you're not just starting fresh, you're picking up right where you left off the last time you played. So we really wanted to capture that in a card game. We did this in Lord of the Rings with our Saga expansions, but Lord of the Rings follows the Saga expansions follow the story of the Lord of the Rings novels very closely. So there's a hard limit on what kind of choices and repercussions we can have for your actions, because ultimately, at the end of the day, Frodo is going to drop the ring in Mount Doom, and we all know that. I hope so. Otherwise, it's bad. So continuity is really important, and the longer the campaign, the more these decisions can build upon themselves. So one decision leads to another decision, and that leads to a third decision, and there's a lot of branching paths. So these decision points, let's talk about these for a little bit. So we have all kinds of decision points littered throughout every campaign in Arkham Horror, the card game. Some of these are going to pop up during gameplay. Some of them are going to pop up during story interludes in between scenarios. And each of these decisions, there's a lot of different decisions that we can do with the system. It's very versatile. So we could have some decisions where it's not clear at all whether one decision is the better option and another one. We can have decisions where the moral option is not necessarily the best one for you from a gameplay standpoint. And we can also have red herrings all over the place. So we thought that was really interesting. Another thing that we do in this game with campaign play is the idea of degrees of success. You may have already noticed if you've been playing that when you got to the end of the first scenario, it didn't say that you won or that you lost, because every scenario just happens until you get to the end, and all the way at the end of the campaign, that's when you'll figure out if you won or lost. So we also did this in a number of other ways. For example, you might have a scenario with 5 different resolutions, and all of them are kind of good, kind of bad. And it's just about which one you got to and the repercussions of that. We also have scenarios where you just try to do as best you can, and however well you did, that's how well you did, and you just have to deal with that moving forward. And then finally, we have scenarios where the goal is to just get to the end, hopefully. So then the last thing that we did with campaign play is experience points and leveling up. This is a really important facet of role-playing games as well, so we wanted to include that in our game, but since this is a card game, we did it with cards. So at the end of every scenario, you're going to earn a certain amount of experience points, and that allows you to purchase new cards for your deck that you can include. Sometimes they're upgrades for existing cards, other times they're brand new cards that you only just now got access to. And this really emulates the experience of leveling up in a role-playing game, but in a really easy and seamless way. And it makes the deck building that you do at the beginning become a slower and more gradual process over the course of an entire campaign, rather than breaking down your deck and restarting every time you do a new scenario. And that helps to reinforce the sense of you and your character. And then finally, we have a campaign log, which you've seen at the back of the rules. And you can, of course, print these out on our website. The campaign log tracks your progress. It tracks what investigators are playing. It tracks what story decisions you've made and what scenarios you've played. And the cool thing about the campaign log is we can do a different campaign with a different log for every campaign. So each campaign is going to have its own log, and it's going to have different things on it than this one. By the way, for those of you playing in our event on Saturday, we're going to have printouts of the campaign log that you can take somewhere over there-ish to use to track your progress. So don't actually write in your rules. And then finally, we're going to talk about style and tone, and I'm going to kick it back to Nate.
All right, so style and tone. This is about how we go about telling the story. What kind of aesthetic decisions did we make while we were putting this game together? And this expresses itself in a few different ways within the game. The first one being the artwork. So Zoe Robinson was the art director for this game, and I kind of, when putting this together, thought back to some of the very early conversations we had with her about kind of some of the goals for the artwork. And one theme that really kind of stuck out is this idea of creating a sense of discomfort through composition. And there are a few different ways in the game that we went about doing this. Some of them are kind of different and almost in opposition to each other, but they all aim towards the same end. So the first one was kind of the creation of these vast, overwhelmingly large cavernous spaces. This kind of creates that sense of isolation or loneliness, and also a sense of great distance, making the viewer feel almost insignificant. The example up here, you're in this large cavern with something huge and menacing and terrible coming down at you, and it does a good job of expressing this strategy. The other one is almost the opposite. It's one of awkward closeness and intimacy. So this is almost like putting the reality of whatever kind of terrible thing has happened to a character in this world kind of right up in the viewer's face in a way that they have to come to terms with it and can't really ignore that it's not happening. One way that this is also reinforced is by creating a cramped and claustrophobic space. Basically, nothing is comfortable. So between these vast distances or these extreme closenesses or awkward angles or whatever, there's no imagery that you get a sense of comfort in the game, and that's kind of one of the underlying strategies in how the artwork was directed. Another strategy that was used in putting the art together for this game is to make use of implied storytelling. This is not showing directly the most terrible or awful moment. Rather, if you focus on the moment just before something terrible happens or the moment right after, you're then inviting the viewer to kind of imagine what is about to happen or what just happened, and that can be more powerful than actually showing the reality of it. Okay, moving on to the next place where style and tone come through, and this was graphic design. So the primary graphic designers on the game were Mercedes Opheim and Evan Simonet. I talked to them a bit about kind of some of the things that they did when doing the graphics on the cards, and a couple interesting tidbits popped up in those conversations. So the first was kind of one of the basic inspirations for the design was a style called Art Nouveau. This is exemplified by some of the intricate linear designs and kind of the natural flowing curves you'll see on Leo DeLuca, the Louisiana Lion up there. In kind of the template around the art, you can see some of the line work going on, as well as some of the curves bordering the art. So this was the reason they chose this style as an inspiration was it kind of set an appropriate time period. This was an art style that was popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through World War I, maybe even a little bit after, and it took it back to that time in a way that that we felt was appropriate. Another source of inspiration was astrological and occult references. On the card back up there, you can see kind of the star chart in the background. You could also see some of the Cthulhu tentacles coming up, some of the stars. You'll see references, these type of references and inspirations throughout both the card templates, the packaging, and a lot of different places, the rule books, a lot of different places that might show up in the general graphics of the game. Another thing that we did that is kind of a departure from the way we usually lay out our cards is on the enemy cards. Basically, for most of our cards, you'll see a card layout where the title is at the top or on the side, the artwork also towards the top of the card, and then a text box near the bottom. This was reversed on the enemies, and this is for a very, very conscious reason. This is to make them more immediate, put them in your face. So if you think about it, you're sitting at a table and there's a card on the table in front of you. The part of the card that is closest to you as the viewer is the bottom of the card. So by moving the artwork and the enemies to the bottom, it makes them a little more immediate, and it puts you a little bit closer to the creatures of the mythos that you might encounter. One final touch that they did is they added a lot of dark shadows throughout the game, both in kind of the templating. You'll notice up near the top of the Ghoul Priest, some of the shadows creeping in as it transitions to light, and then also around the artwork down towards the bottom here, you could see in the credit bar even there's shadows coming up over like the illustrator's name and in that lower corner. So there's touches like this added throughout the card pool as well to just increase that sense of shadowy mystery. One final place where style and tone can express themselves in this game is through flavor text. We worked with Katrina Ostrander and the story team on the game's flavor text, and we defined the flavor text basically as anything in the game that is not rules text or ability text. This is kind of the narrative passages on the act and the agenda cards telling you what's happening next in the story, and then also on all the different card types, there's places where different details or implications are hinted at in the one or two sentences that might appear below a card ability. So One strategy that we generally used here is trying to create a sense of inexplicable strangeness. If you think about what's going on in an Arkham game, you have normal people from the real world being thrust into these unnatural, arcane experiences that they're not going to fully comprehend. So we tried to write a lot of the game's text with that in mind, that the players might know things that the characters in the game did not. We tried to keep in mind what the characters in the game would be experiencing with their senses and thinking. They might not know the name of the chaos monster that they're fighting, so we won't come out and just say that in the story. We'll hint at it, we'll imply what's going on, but not everything is always fully explained. A couple of different ways this is done. There's kind of the implications or the partial explanations, and sometimes it's even just a red herring. You might encounter something or see something that you think is important at the time, but it's really just there to kind of maintain that sense of disorientation and kind of awe at what kind of arcane experience is going on. Another strategy that we took occasionally in this game, this is a departure from all of our other LCGs, we've never done anything like this before in an LCG, is interweaving the flavor text with game text. One example here is the main path, and this can add immediacy to that flavor text that you wouldn't get if you had to read an ability first, process what that ability did, and then jump down and read the flavor text. The example here is the resign effect, saying there's nothing we can do to stop them. You flee from the woods, leaving Arkham to its grisly fate. So the other thing that doing this accomplishes is it connects that flavor text to one particular part of the ability. If that line was just the general flavor text of the card, it really wouldn't make a whole lot of sense when you weren't resigning. It's only tied to that one contextual moment. So by interweaving it like that, you can get a little bit more kind of pinpoint control over where you want that flavor text to kick in, and that's a really helpful thing when you're trying to tell a story with a game. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. We're now going to take some questions. I should point out beforehand, we can't comment on future products or events or plans we might have, but we can try to answer questions on pretty much anything else.
One of the points that Nate brought up earlier is that, is that the locations can be really, really flexible, and we can really do whatever we want with them. So yeah, there's going to be all kinds of different locations in the game. Just throughout the first cycle, you'll see a wide range of different locations.
No, this game was developed from the start as a card game. We have the app integration with the Mansions game, so it's they both kind of have their own place.
We only have a pretty limited amount of card slots in each of our Mythos packs, so 60 cards. So we do explore that option sometimes, but for the most part, we want to give as good an experience right out the gate as we can.
Yeah, although I think there are some opportunities to do that. Even in the core set, there's some places where you'll select from a subset of cards, so you don't know exactly what you're coming up against in the setup of a scenario. We'll definitely try to work in more of those type of effects.
Yeah, you also won't necessarily have the same encounter sets every time you play a scenario. I think my favorite moment was the time that we left our boss to die in the hallway. I barricaded myself in, and I was like, okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think my favorite moment was my investigator was really close to death, and Matt's tried to heal me, but failed miserably and instead wounded me, so I died, and yeah, that was fun.
I wasn't the doctor.
I think the one I ended up playing the most in development was Skids, and mostly that's because I kind of enjoy gambling, and I play a lot of gambling type games, so Skids was kind of a natural appeal to me.
I like Daisy. Her nickname is Spooks, so take that for what you will. The Grim Rule came about because in the Lord of the Rings community, whenever somebody asked me or Caleb a rules question, they always joked that it almost always turned out to be whatever was worst for them at that moment in time. So that ended up being their sort of de facto answer whenever somebody had a rules question. They'd be like, "I'll just do whatever was worse." And actually, what we found was that helped them keep the game rolling. So we really liked that. So I actually just asked Nate right out of hand, like, "Can we make that a rule right under the golden rule?" And he was like, "Yeah, we'll call it the Grim rule." Other names for it include Arkham's Razor. Thank you to the Arkham LCG community for that one. So.
I think the only recommended number of players is kind of what it says on the materials, 1 to 4. One thing I've kind of noticed, to make another comparison between this game and Lord of the Rings, is I do feel that we learned a lot in how to scale the game better after working with Lord of the Rings. So Lord of the Rings, really the only real mechanism of scaling is that you draw more encounter cards as you play. This game has that moving forward, but it also has several other things. Kind of the per investigator symbol really helps in that it scales the amount of progress you have to make based on it, and then you can also use that in other places to like scale enemy stats or skill checks you might have to make. There's different ways to use that, and kind of just having those extra elements, I think the game scales much better.
It's important to note too, I'm just going to hop in and say that there are rules for joining or leaving a campaign too. So even if you start a campaign by yourself or with one other person, you can have other people jump in right in the middle of that campaign pretty seamlessly. So good to know. Well, we have the one treachery cancellation card in the core set has a drawback. That's the big thing that's the first thing I thought of. So yeah, it's not. Also, there's 5 classes instead of 4, so it's not going to be as easy to integrate into all of your decks. So that's important, especially for capturing the Arkham feel, that you're not always going to be able to stop what's happening to you.
Yeah, I think for me, kind of the one point I already touched on in the presentation was kind of the evolution of the quest deck into having 2 going, so that it's basically so that the bad guys had something that they were trying to do other than just stopping the players from win. I think that is a big evolution. The other one is the each investigator drawing their own card. I feel that helps keep all the players involved rather than just having one player draw them off and read them. So I think both of those are cases where after having gone through the experience of Lord of the Rings, kind of finding places where we can improve.
Yeah, I think in any cooperative game, there's always the danger of having that person who sort of runs everything, and I think Arkham handles that pretty well, having everybody doing their own thing and occasionally coming together for aid and assistance.
A lot of it, I think, was just kind of like when we encountered kind of problems or difficulties with the development, seeing if there were answers in any of our other games. I think one of the ones where you might see a very obvious fit is the action system from Netrunner, where basically the player has kind of a freeform turn where they can do any 3 of a variety of different actions. What this allowed us to do, this fit really well with the RPG experience we were going for, where basically you're acting out your character and you're not confined by, okay, this is now the investigation phase, so you must investigate. It's kind of like, no, it's your turn, you can do what you want. So I think it's more, there wasn't really like an active plan where we set out like, we need to take this from this game, this from this game. It was just, as we were working on different parts of the game, if there was something in the catalog that was like, yes, this is a really good fit here, we were borrowing freely there.
I also like to personally sprinkle references to other games throughout Arkham, so see if you can find them all. Like Pokemon. That's a good question. That's a problem that we sort of tackled, I think, pretty early on when we were working on campaign play. We wanted each campaign to start fresh, and we didn't really play test too much of characters rolling over from one campaign to another. But we also wanted to allow someone to do that if they really wanted to. Even though personally I think it would kind of throw off the balance a bit. So we included that line in the campaign guide that says, if you really want to, you can take your character and move them into the next campaign. But really, ideally, the game is built for you to start fresh every time you play and go forward from zero experience all the way to the end. That's what's going to get you the best experience.
I think that there's a lot of replay value in this game as well as in Lord of the Rings if you are drawn to the act of deck building, in that you can play it with your best investigator and your best deck and have one experience, and then you can play it with the other investigators or with different combinations of investigators and get different stories. Particularly with the weakness system in this game, you're going to get different challenges thrown at you based on which investigators you bring. There are also, with the kind of the branching decision paths, there's a lot of cases where you might make a decision and come to one consequence and then wonder, well, what would have happened if we didn't do that at the end of scenario 3? And you might want to go back to find those other paths, kind of in the same way that like a choose your own adventure book, you can reread it a few times, and between the combination of making different choices and playing with different decks, there are options for replayability to be a novel experience each time through. Thanks for
I don't have a card.
Thanks for coming.